What secrets lurked behind ancient stone walls? What drove women bound by sacred vows to risk everything for freedom? From the 1400s to the 1800s, some women chose a different path, a path of defiance and escape. Number 9. Katharina von Bora, the Reformation's bold escape. In the early 16th century, as the winds of change began to sweep across Europe, threatening to dismantle centuries-old traditions, a young woman named Katharina von Bora found herself ensnared in a life she had not chosen. Born in 1499, the daughter of a minor Saxon nobleman, Katharina's fate, like that of many young women of her time and station, was largely decided by her family's circumstances and the prevailing societal norms. Her mother passed away when Katharina was still very young, and her father quickly remarried. For reasons that remain somewhat debated by historians, perhaps economic hardship, perhaps a lack of suitable dowry for a marriage, or simply the common practice of placing daughters in religious institutions, Katharina was sent to the Benedictine convent of Brenna when she was just 5 years old. It was a common destination for girls from noble families, offering an education and a structured life, albeit one behind high walls. By the age of 10, Katharina had been transferred to the Cistercian monastery of Nimschen near Grimma in Saxony. Here she entered the novitiate, a period of trial and instruction for aspiring nuns, and at 16 and 15, she took her vows, becoming a professed nun. For Katharina, like the other cloistered women, this meant a life dedicated to prayer, contemplation, and strict adherence to the Benedictine rule. Their days were measured by bells summoning them to worship, labor in the convent gardens, or scriptorium and quiet reflection. The world outside the convent walls, with its vibrant markets, political upheavals, and burgeoning intellectual movements, was a distant echo, largely inaccessible and, according to their vows, irrelevant to their spiritual journey. The Nimschen convent was known for its strict discipline and traditional practices, providing little room for personal autonomy or deviation from the established routine. Yet beyond those same walls, a revolution was brewing. Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar and professor in Wittenberg, had ignited a theological firestorm with his 95 Theses in 1517. His ideas, especially his assertion that salvation came through faith alone and that monastic vows were not necessary for spiritual salvation, began to ripple through German society. Luther's writings were not merely theological debates. They challenged the very foundations of the medieval church and, by extension, the social order that upheld it. For women like Katharina, who were bound by vows that Luther deemed potentially unscriptural and unfree, his message was a potent, dangerous spark. The Sisters of Nimschen, despite their cloistered existence, were not entirely isolated. News, pamphlets, and Luther's writings found their way into the convent, perhaps brought by visitors, chaplains, or sympathetic relatives. It is recorded that some of the nuns, including Katharina, became deeply interested in Luther's teachings. They began to question the sanctity and permanence of their vows, viewing them less as a path to salvation and more as a spiritual confinement, a life choice made at an age too young to truly comprehend its eternal implications. Tension within the convent grew, a silent battle between the desire for traditional obedience and the burgeoning belief in individual freedom and direct relationship with God. Katharina, known for her strong will and practical nature, emerged as a leader among the nuns who wished to leave. She, along with 11 other sisters, hatched a daring plan. They approached their relatives, pleading for help to escape their monastic lives. However, their pleas were met with refusal. The families feared the severe social and legal repercussions of aiding nuns in breaking their vows, an act considered sacrilegious and criminal by both church and state. The act of assisting a nun to leave her convent was seen as abduction, a serious offense. Undeterred by the lack of support from their families, Katharina and her fellow rebels turned to Luther himself. They sent a secret letter, conveyed perhaps through a sympathetic merchant or an anonymous messenger, appealing directly to him for assistance. They detailed their deep dissatisfaction with their monastic life and their earnest desire to live in accordance with what they now believed was true Christian teaching, which allowed for marriage and life outside the cloister. Luther, a staunch advocate for the abolition of monasticism, was moved by their plight. He understood the immense courage it took for these women to defy the strictures of their age. On the night of April 7th, 1523, a significant moment in the history of the Reformation unfolded. Leonhard Kopp, a respected councilman of Torgau and a fishmonger who regularly supplied the Nimschen convent with herring barrels, played a crucial role. He arrived at the convent as usual, but this time his wagon carried more than just fish. Under the cover of darkness and carefully concealed among the barrels of herring, Katharina von Bora and 11 other nuns climbed into the wagon, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. It was a perilous journey, fraught with the risk of discovery, capture, and severe punishment. The penalty for breaking vows was not merely excommunication. It could include imprisonment, public shaming, or worse. For Koppe, the risk was also immense, as he could be accused of abduction and suffer dire consequences. They successfully made their escape from the convent and were transported to Wittenberg, the heart of the burgeoning Reformation. Luther took on the responsibility of finding suitable arrangements for the 12 former nuns. It was a challenging task, as these women, having renounced their vows, were now socially marginalized without dowries, and often alienated from their families. Most of them eventually married, some to students of Luther's or other reformers, finding new lives in the transformed religious landscape. Katharina von Bora, however, remained unmarried for some time. Luther initially tried to arrange a marriage for her with a man named Glatz, but Katharina refused, stating her preference for either Nicholas von Amsdorf, a pastor, or Luther himself. On June 13, 1525, to the astonishment of many, Martin Luther, the former monk and now leader of the Protestant Reformation, married Katharina von Bora. Their marriage was a profound statement, a direct challenge to the celibacy of the clergy and a living embodiment of Luther's theological reforms. Their home, the former Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg, became a bustling household. Katharina proved to be an exceptionally capable and practical wife, managing a complex household that included their 6 children, Luther's students, boarders, and a constant stream of visitors. She managed the finances, brewed beer, raised livestock, and cultivated a garden, ensuring the family's sustenance and well-being. Luther affectionately referred to her as "my Lord Kate," or "my morning star," and often praised her intelligence and steadfastness. Her administrative skills and her ability to run a self-sufficient household allowed Luther the freedom to dedicate himself to writing, preaching, and leading the Reformation. Katharina's life after her dramatic escape was one of remarkable transformation, from a cloistered nun to the wife of one of history's most influential figures. She faced numerous challenges, including poverty, illness, and the political and religious turmoil of the era. After Luther's death in 1546, Katharina faced increasing hardship and was forced to flee Wittenberg several times due to war and plague. She died in Torgau in 1552, a resilient woman who had redefined what it meant to be a woman of faith in a changing world. Her escape from Nimschen was not merely an act of personal liberation, but a symbolic step that paved the way for countless others to reimagine their lives outside the traditional confines of the monastic system. Her story stands as a testament to personal conviction and the profound impact of religious reform on individual lives. Number 8. Ursula von Münsterberg, the princess who abandoned her vows for a new faith. The early 16th century was a time of immense spiritual and social upheaval across Europe, especially within the German lands. It was an era when the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was openly challenged, and individuals, including those within the consecrated life, were forced to confront deeply held beliefs and make choices that would forever alter the course of their lives. Among these was Ursula von Münsterberg, a woman of royal lineage, whose decision to leave the cloister encapsulated the profound personal impact of the Reformation. Born around 1491, Ursula was a princess of the House of Podebretti, a prominent Bohemian noble family. Her grandfather was George of Podebretti, who had been the king of Bohemia. As was common for daughters of noble houses who were not destined for politically advantageous marriages, Ursula was placed in a convent at a young age. By 1500, she had entered the Magdalene convent at Liegnitz in Silesia. This Cistercian nunnery offered a structured life, education, and spiritual devotion, a respectable path for a high-born woman. Ursula took her vows and lived the life of a cloistered nun for many years, dedicating herself to prayer, study, and the communal life of the convent. The daily rhythm of bells, psalms, and quiet reflection defined her existence, seemingly set apart from the tumultuous world beyond the convent walls. However, the ideas of Martin Luther, disseminated through pamphlets and sermons, began to penetrate even the most secluded corners of society. Luther's emphasis on sola scriptura, scripture alone, and sola fide, faith alone, directly challenged the efficacy of monastic vows as a means of salvation. He argued that enforced celibacy was unbiblical and that a life of marriage was a divinely ordained state open to all, including former clergy and religious. These radical notions resonated deeply with many, including some within the monastic orders who felt trapped or spiritually unfulfilled by their vows. For Ursula von Münsterberg, a woman of intelligence and conviction, these teachings struck a profound chord. She, like many other nuns, found herself wrestling with the theological implications of Luther's message. The traditional arguments from monastic life, once seemingly unassailable, now appeared vulnerable under the light of the new theology. The idea of a personal relationship with God, unmediated by monastic institutions, offered a different path to spiritual fulfillment, one that might lie outside the convent walls. Ursula was not alone in her questioning. Convent at Liegnitz, like many others, became a site of internal debate and growing unrest. Some sisters clung fiercely to tradition, while others, inspired by the reformers, felt an increasing spiritual unease within their chosen path. Ursula, armed with a strong understanding of the theological arguments and the courage born of deep conviction, began to advocate openly within the convent for the principles of the Reformation. She engaged in discussions with her fellow nuns, challenging their understanding of their vows and the nature of salvation. Her activism within the convent soon brought her into conflict with the convent's leadership and conservative elements. The situation escalated, and Ursula, facing increasing pressure and perhaps feeling that she could no longer remain true to her new beliefs while confined by her vows, made the monumental decision to leave. In 1528, Ursula von Münsterberg, a professed nun of nearly 3 decades, broke her vows and departed from the Liegnitz convent. It was a dramatic and courageous act, risking social ostracism, family disapproval, and ecclesiastical censure. For a woman of her noble standing, such a departure carried even greater weight, as it reflected not just on her but on her entire lineage. Upon leaving the convent, Ursula did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, she became an active and vocal proponent of the Reformation. Her noble birth and her unique journey from nun to reformer gave her a powerful platform. She wrote and published a polemic against the monastic life, directly addressing her former sisters at Liegnitz. In her writings, she explained her reasons for leaving, eloquently articulating her theological convictions that monastic vows were not in accordance with biblical truth, and that true salvation lay in faith alone, not in works or institutional commitments. Her arguments were direct and passionate, aimed at convincing others to follow her path toward spiritual freedom. Ursula's actions and writings gained significant attention, particularly within the nascent Protestant movement. Her status as a former nun and a princess lent credibility and notoriety to her cause, making her a compelling figure in the Reformation narrative. Her decision to speak out publicly against the very institution that had shaped her life was an act of profound defiance. Her journey culminated in marriage, another bold step for a former nun, which was strongly encouraged by the Reformers as a legitimate and holy state. Ursula married Hieronymus von Bieberstein, a knight and supporter of the Reformation. Their marriage was a testament to the new theological understanding that affirmed the sanctity of marriage and family life over the traditional celibate ideal. She lived out her remaining years as a married woman and a dedicated advocate for the Protestant faith, often cited as an example of the personal transformations wrought by the Reformation. Ursula von Münsterberg died in 1534, just 6 years after her dramatic departure from the convent. Her story is a vivid example of how the grand historical currents of the Reformation played out in the personal lives of individuals. Her choice to abandon the cloister, not merely for personal freedom but for deeply held theological convictions, highlights the profound spiritual courage required to defy deeply entrenched societal and religious norms. She was a woman who, when faced with a seismic shift in understanding, chose to break free from her past and embrace a new path, becoming a symbol of the intellectual and spiritual liberation that the Reformation promised. Number 7. Anna Sophia of Quedlinburg, the abbess who eloped. In the intricate tapestry of European nobility and religious institutions, the role of an abbess was often a blend of spiritual leadership, administrative responsibility, and for women of high birth, significant political influence. The abbess of a powerful imperial abbey could command lands, revenues, and a degree of autonomy that was rare for women in her era. Such was the position held by Anna Sophia of Quedlinburg, a woman whose lineage and destiny seemed to intertwine with the solemn grandeur of her office until a dramatic personal choice rewrote her story. Born in 1663, Anna Sophia was a princess of the House of Schwarzburg-Rudolstadt, a noble family with deep roots in the Holy Roman Empire. As was common for daughters of princely houses, especially those with many children or limited marital prospects, a career in the church was often a viable and honorable path. The Imperial Abbey of Quedlinburg, a powerful Protestant women's convent in Saxony, was a particularly prestigious destination. It was an institution that functioned more like a secular principality than a strictly cloistered monastery, offering its abbesses considerable worldly power and independence within the framework of their religious roles. Abbess was effectively a sovereign ruler over her own territory, exercising jurisdiction over towns, lands, and subjects. Anna Sophia was destined for this path from a young age. She was prepared for leadership within the abbey, a role that combined spiritual duties with demanding administrative and political responsibilities. In 1686, at the relatively young age of 23, she was elected Abbess of Quedlinburg. This was a significant achievement, placing her at the head of a powerful and wealthy institution, granting her the title of Princess Abbess, and making her a figure of considerable authority in the region. Her duties would have included overseeing the spiritual welfare of the canonesses, managing the vast estates of the abbey, engaging in political negotiations with neighboring rulers, and upholding the rights and privileges of her autonomous territory. She held her court, conducted official business, and participated in imperial diets. A powerful woman in a man's world. Her life as Abbess of Quedlinburg continued for some years, a life of prestige, power, and the ceremonial gravity of her office. She seemingly fulfilled the expectations placed upon her by her birth and her election. However, beneath the surface of her public duties, Anna Sophia harbored a personal desire that stood in stark contrast to the celibate and official life she led. Though Protestant abbesses and canonesses were not bound by the same strict perpetual vows of Catholic nuns, they were still expected to maintain a life of sobriety and spiritual dedication, often remaining unmarried. To abandon such a high office for personal reasons was virtually unheard of. The details of how this desire manifested remain somewhat cloaked in the discreet annals of history, but it is clear that Anna Sophia fell in love. The object of her affection was one of her own court officials, an equestrian and a captain named Hans Friedrich von Krosigk. Such a relationship, even within the more relaxed conventions of a Protestant abbey, was a profound breach of propriety for an abbess, particularly one of Anna Sophia's standing. The potential scandal was immense, threatening not only her personal reputation, but also the standing of the venerable Abbey of Quedlinburg itself. The decision to leave her post and elope with Captain von Krosigk was not a simple choice, but a dramatic rupture with her past, her family, and her princely obligations. It was an act of profound personal rebellion against the expectations of her station and the strictures of her office. Precise circumstances of her departure are not widely detailed, but her actions spoke volumes. In 1701, Anna Sophia, the Princess Abbess of Quedlinburg, abandoned her powerful office and its accompanying dignities. She relinquished her spiritual and temporal authority, stepping down from a position of immense power to pursue a personal relationship. Her departure sent shockwaves through the political and ecclesiastical circles of the Holy Roman Empire. An abbess, especially one of Quedlinburg's prominence, simply did not elope. This was not a quiet resignation or a dignified retirement. It was a sensational and public abandonment of her duties and a direct defiance of the norms governing female royalty and religious leadership. The scandal would have been immense, whispered about in courts and princely households across Europe. Her family, the House of Schwarzburg-Rudolstadt, would have faced considerable embarrassment and pressure to manage the fallout. Following her dramatic departure, Anna Sophia married Hans Friedrich von Krosigk. Her life was fundamentally transformed. She transitioned from being a powerful sovereign abbess with her own court and territory to being the wife of a relatively lower-ranking nobleman. This was a radical change in status and lifestyle, reflecting a deliberate choice to prioritize personal happiness over the trappings of power and ancestral duty. Their marriage, though scandalous in its inception, appears to have been enduring. They lived out their lives together, far from the grand halls of Quedlinburg, in a more private and unassuming manner. Anna Sophia lived for a number of years after her elopement, dying in 1701, the same year as her dramatic departure. It is possible her death occurred shortly after the elopement, perhaps exacerbating the shock, or that the records consolidate the events. Regardless, her story is a compelling example of a woman who, despite holding a position of immense power and prestige, chose to defy societal and institutional expectations for love. Her runaway was not from a strict cloistered life in the traditional Catholic sense, but a dramatic abdication of an even higher, more visible spiritual and temporal authority, making her story a powerful testament to the allure of personal freedom and the pursuit of individual desire, even at the cost of profounder power. Number 6. Madeleine de Saint-Baslemont, Anne-Marie de la Mauve, the dueling nun who embraced adventure. The 17th century in France was a period of flamboyant aristocracy, rigid social codes, and fervent religious practice. For noblewomen, life often presented a limited set of choices: marriage into a politically advantageous family, or entrance into a convent. For Anne-Marie de la Mauve, born in 1618 into a distinguished Lorraine noble family, the latter path seemed to be her destined one. She was placed at a young age into the Augustinian convent of St. Solve in Verdun, where she took her vows, becoming Sister Madeleine. She was expected to live a life of piety, obedience, and quiet contemplation, a life firmly enclosed within the convent walls. However, Madeleine de Saint-Baslemont was not destined for a quiet life. Even within the cloister, hints of her defiant and unconventional spirit emerged. Stories from her time in the convent speak of a woman with an independent mind, a disdain for strict rules, and a restless energy that chafed against the confines of monastic discipline. She was known to challenge authority, question dogma, and exhibit a thirst for life that was ill-suited to the solemn vows she had taken. Convent, designed to shape souls into perfect conformity, seemed to inadvertently sharpen her rebellious nature. The precise circumstances of her departure from St. Solve are debated, shrouded in a mixture of fact and legend that only adds to her mystique. Some accounts suggest she simply walked out, defying the locked gates and the very concept of enclosure. Others hint at a more dramatic escape, perhaps involving a sympathetic outsider or a moment of opportune chaos. What is clear is that at some point, Madeleine de Saint-Baslemont renounced her vows and left the convent, a profoundly scandalous act for a woman of her standing in devout 17th century France. This was not a quiet departure. It was a bold, public defiance of the Church and society. Once free of the convent walls, Madeleine truly began to live a life that would shock and fascinate her contemporaries. She discarded her nun's habit, not for modest civilian clothes, but for men's attire. Dressed as a man, she adopted a new identity, traveling freely, participating in activities typically reserved for men, and embracing a life of adventure and danger. This act of cross-dressing was not merely a disguise. It was a deliberate statement of defiance against gender norms and a means to navigate a world that offered far more freedom to men than to women. Her newfound freedom and her audacious persona led her into a series of extraordinary escapades that quickly became the stuff of legend. Madeleine, or rather the male persona she adopted, was known for her skill with a sword and her willingness to engage in duels. Duels, illegal but common among the nobility, were the ultimate expression of honor and bravado, exclusively male pursuits. That a former nun, dressed as a man, would participate in and win duels was utterly unprecedented and scandalous. She was not merely a spectator. She was a combatant, facing down opponents with a skill that earned her a fearsome reputation. Stories recount her involvement in several such encounters, always emerging victorious, further cementing her notorious image. Beyond dueling, Madeleine lived a life of remarkable independence. She traveled widely, moving through different regions of France, engaging with various social strata, and observing the world with a keen, unburdened eye. She was known for her wit, her sharp intelligence, and her engaging conversation, captivating those she encountered, whether they knew her true identity or not. Her life was a testament to personal autonomy, lived on her own terms in an era where women were expected to be confined to domesticity or the cloister. Her dramatic life naturally attracted attention from authorities both secular and ecclesiastical. Breaking religious vows was a grave offense, and her cross-dressing and dueling only compounded the scandal. However, Madeleine seemed to possess a remarkable ability to evade sustained capture or punishment, perhaps due to her noble connections, her cunning, or simply the sheer audacity that disarmed her pursuers. She became a figure of rebellious freedom, embodying the very antithesis of the pious, submissive woman society expected. The later years of Madeleine de Saint-Baslemont are less documented, but her legend persisted. She passed away in 1698, having lived a life that defied every convention of her time. Her story, passed down through anecdotes and scattered historical mentions, is a powerful narrative of a woman who refused to be contained by the strictures of her birth, her vows, or her gender. She ran away, not just from a convent, but from the entire societal construct that sought to define her. Madeleine de Saint-Baslemont remains a captivating figure, a true rebel whose life illustrated the immense courage required to forge one's own path in a world determined to dictate it. Number 5. Dorothea of Brandenburg, the princess who escaped the cloister's political prison. The medieval and early modern periods were rife with political maneuvering, dynastic ambitions, and strategic alliances often cemented through marriage. For women of royal or noble birth, their lives were frequently pawns in these grand games, with their destinies dictated by the needs of their families and states. Some were married off for political gain. Others were relegated to convents, becoming in essence political prisoners disguised as pious devotees. Such was the initial fate of Dorothea of Brandenburg, a princess whose forced monasticism became a dramatic tale of defiance and eventual freedom. Born around 1430, Dorothea was a daughter of Frederick I, Elector of Brandenburg, and Elizabeth of Bavaria. Her family was one of the most powerful princely houses in the Holy Roman Empire, deeply entangled in the complex web of German politics. As was common for daughters in such families, Dorothea's future was not her own to decide. Her father, keen to secure his family's influence and consolidate power, saw his children as instruments for political advancement. In 1441, at a tender age, Dorothea was sent to the convent of Heilsbronn, a Cistercian monastery in Franconia. The reasons for this decision were purely political. Her father, Frederick I, was seeking to exert control over the bishopric of Würzburg. By placing Dorothea in the convent, he aimed to strengthen his family's ties to the region and potentially influence the local ecclesiastical structures. It was a common strategy. Placing family members in powerful church positions or nunneries could create a network of influence. Dorothea was not given a choice. She was effectively compelled into a life of religious vows, her personal desires sacrificed for dynastic ambition. Within the walls of Heilsbronn, Dorothea was expected to follow the strict monastic rule, dedicating her life to prayer, silence, and communal duties. This was not a vocation she had chosen. It was a form of enforced exile, a gilded cage designed to serve political ends. Her days would have been regulated by the sound of bells, summoning her to the choir for divine office, to the refectory for meals, and to various tasks within the cloister. For a young woman of royal blood, accustomed perhaps to a certain degree of comfort and the broader world, this cloistered existence imposed against her will must have been a profound hardship. However, the political landscape shifted, and with it, Dorothea's fortunes. The strategic calculations that had placed her in the convent began to change. Her family's alliances and interests evolved, and the need for a daughter in a convent gave way to a new political opportunity, a marriage alliance. The opportunity arose for Dorothea to marry Duke Henry IV of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a significant match that promised to strengthen the Brandenburg family's position in northern Germany. The decision to release Dorothea from her vows was a complex one requiring papal dispensation. Breaking monastic vows was a serious matter, requiring the highest ecclesiastical approval. Yet, for powerful princes, such dispensations could be obtained, particularly when the reasons were politically compelling and financially supported. The process would have involved petitions to Rome, negotiations, and probably significant payments. For Dorothea, this meant a sudden dramatic shift from a life of imposed spiritual confinement to one of anticipated marital duty and secular power. Dorothy's departure from the Heilsbronn convent in 1446 was not an escape in the clandestine dramatic sense of a secret flight under cover of darkness. Instead, it was a sanctioned, albeit highly unusual, liberation from vows that were never truly her own. However, it was a runaway in a profound personal sense, a break from a life she was forced into, a dramatic reclaiming of her agency and a re-entry into the world she had been shut out of. She left the quiet, enclosed life of the convent to embrace a very different destiny, one that involved political responsibility and a public role as a duchess. On September 17, 1446, Dorothea married Duke Henry IV of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Her marriage marked the culmination of her liberation from the cloister and the beginning of a new chapter. As Duchess of Mecklenburg, she fulfilled her dynastic role, giving birth to children and contributing to the political stability of her new home. She lived a life that was far removed from the solemn routines of the convent, demonstrating a resilience that allowed her to adapt to such profound changes. Dorothea of Brandenburg passed away in 1495. Her story is a poignant example of how women, particularly those of high birth, could be used as political pawns, their personal freedom sacrificed for the ambitions of their male relatives. Yet, her narrative also demonstrates the possibility of escape, even if it was through the complex machinery of political and ecclesiastical power, allowing her to abandon a life she never chose and reclaim a future she could truly live. Her runaway was a calculated liberation from a life that was not her own, making her a powerful symbol of quiet defiance against a predetermined destiny. Number 4. Elizabeth of Brunswick-Lüneburg, the Duchess who left her vows for love and reform. The early 16th century was a time of seismic shifts across Europe, particularly in the German states where the Protestant Reformation was gaining untoppable momentum. For women of noble birth, religious life was a common path, often chosen for pious reasons, but sometimes imposed by family or circumstance. Elizabeth of Brunswick-Lüneburg was one such woman born into the powerful House of Welf, a prominent princely family within the Holy Roman Empire. Her life was shaped by these converging forces, leading her on a dramatic journey from the cloister to a life of love and active participation in the religious changes of her era. Born in 1494, Elizabeth was a daughter of Duke Henry I of Brunswick-Lüneburg. As a young woman, she followed a path common for daughters of her rank, who were not designated for politically significant marriages. She entered the Benedictine convent of Wienhausen, a venerable institution known for its deep spiritual traditions and artistic treasures. In 1508, at the age of 14, Elizabeth became a professed nun, taking solemn vows that bound her to a life of celibacy, poverty, and obedience within the cloister. For over a decade, she lived according to the Benedictine rule, dedicating her days to prayer, communal life, and the quiet rhythm of monastic existence. Convent walls provided a sanctuary from the outside world, a place of spiritual focus, but also a barrier to personal autonomy and the broader currents of change. As the 1520s dawned, the fervent ideas of Martin Luther and other reformers began to penetrate even the most secluded corners of Germany. Luther's critiques of monasticism, his advocacy for the marriage of clergy, and his emphasis on individual faith over institutional rituals posed a direct challenge to the very foundation of Elizabeth's life. The debates about the validity of vows, the nature of salvation, and the role of the Church spread like wildfire, reaching convents and monasteries. For Elizabeth, these new theological arguments resonated deeply. Like many other nuns of the era, she began to question the spiritual efficacy of her vows and the true path to salvation. Quiet questioning within the convent grew into a profound personal and theological conviction that her life as a nun might not be God's true calling for her. The atmosphere in many convents became increasingly polarized, with traditionalists clashing with those who were drawn to the new faith. Adding another layer to Elizabeth's unfolding story was the emergence of a personal connection. She became involved with a man outside the convent, Duke Charles of Gellert, a powerful and independent ruler. The nature of their initial connection is not precisely clear, but it developed into a deep romantic bond. This burgeoning relationship, combined with her evolving theological convictions, created an irresistible pull away from her monastic life. To fall in love and consider marriage was an extraordinary step for a professed nun, risking excommunication, public shame, and severe social repercussions. In 1524, driven by her love for Charles and her belief in the new Protestant teachings, Elizabeth made the monumental decision to leave the Wienhausen convent. This was not a quiet departure. It was a defiant act, an open break with her vows and the expectations of her family and society. Her runaway was a deliberate and public abandonment of her monastic identity. She faced considerable opposition, not only from the church, but also from her own family, who would have been concerned about the scandal and its impact on their dynastic reputation. Upon leaving the convent, Elizabeth pursued her relationship with Charles of Geller. However, due to political complications, and perhaps the difficulty of obtaining a formal dispensation from her vows in a way acceptable to all parties, their marriage faced obstacles. It was a complex situation, with Charles being a powerful, independent-minded duke, and Elizabeth being a former nun from a prominent family. The path to a legitimate union was fraught with political and ecclesiastical hurdles. Eventually, Elizabeth did marry. However, it was not to Charles of Geller. Instead, she married Johann Frederick of Pomerania-Wolgast, a staunch Protestant prince and an active supporter of the Reformation. This marriage, in 1533, further solidified her commitment to the Protestant cause and her new life. Her marriage to a Protestant ruler was a clear statement of her theological alignment and her renunciation of her Catholic monastic past. As the Duchess of Pomerania, Wolgast Elizabeth embraced her new role, raising a family and supporting her husband in the religious and political changes sweeping through their territories. Elizabeth lived a full life after leaving the convent, dying in 1572. Her story is a compelling blend of personal desire and the broader currents of the Reformation. She was a woman who, despite being bound by solemn vows from a young age, found the courage to break free, driven by both love and a profound reevaluation of her faith. Her runaway was not merely an escape from a life of enclosure, but a courageous embrace of a new theological path and a different kind of personal fulfillment, making her a remarkable figure in the history of religious reform and female autonomy. Number 3. Anna Regina von Freiberg, the Reformation sister who sought freedom. In the 16th century, the German lands were a crucible of change, where deeply entrenched religious practices and social structures were challenged by the burgeoning Protestant Reformation. For women within monastic orders, this period presented both profound dilemmas and unforeseen opportunities. Among the many nuns who grappled with these seismic shifts was Anna Regina von Freiberg, a woman whose decision to leave her convent reflected the widespread desire for a new spiritual and personal freedom. Anna Regina von Freiberg hailed from a noble family in Saxony, a region that quickly became a hotbed of Lutheran reform. Like many daughters of the nobility, she was placed in a convent, the Dominican nunnery of St. Afra in Meissen, at a young age. While the exact date of her entry and profession of vows is not widely known, it is clear she lived a significant portion of her early adult life behind the cloister walls. The Dominican order was known for its intellectual rigor and strict adherence to contemplative life, meaning Anna Regina would have been educated in scripture and theology, but also bound by the demanding routines of prayer, silence, and communal duties. Her life was defined by the tolling of bells, the chanting of psalms, and the spiritual disciplines designed to foster detachment from the secular world. However, the world beyond St. Afra's walls was anything but silent or detached. Martin Luther's treatises, particularly his critiques of monasticism and his emphasis on justification by faith alone, were circulating widely. He argued that monastic vows were not only unnecessary for salvation, but could even be an impediment, and he actively encouraged monks and nuns to leave their cloisters and embrace marriage and a secular life as equally, if not more, pleasing to God. These radical ideas reached the ears of cloistered women through sympathetic visitors, reformed priests, or even smuggled pamphlets. For Anna, Regina, and many of her sisters, Luther's arguments offered a compelling, almost liberating alternative to their cloistered existence. They began to question the spiritual validity of their perpetual vows, which had been taken at a young age, often without full understanding or genuine vocation. Convent became a place of internal dissent, a microcosm of the larger religious struggles engulfing Europe. Some nuns clung to tradition, fearful of eternal damnation and societal censure, while others felt an increasingly powerful pull toward the new doctrine of individual faith and freedom. Anna Regina von Freiberg was among those who embraced the spirit of the Reformation. She recognized that her continued adherence to monastic life, as now understood through Lutheran teachings, might be contrary to her conscience. The decision to leave the convent was fraught with immense personal risk. It meant defying the authority of the Church, risking excommunication, and facing the potential disapproval and ostracism from her family and wider society. For a woman, leaving the convent also meant facing an uncertain future without the protection and structure of the monastic community or the familial support, often withdrawn from those who broke their vows. Sometime in the 1520s, amidst the height of the Reformation spread in Saxony, Anna Regina von Freiberg made her move. She left the Dominican nunnery of St. Afra. While the exact details of her departure are not as widely sensationalized as some other cases, her act was part of a larger, collective movement of nuns and monks who were abandoning their traditional roles across German territories. Many were aided by local Protestant authorities or sympathetic individuals who believed in the righteousness of their cause. A runaway was not necessarily a clandestine dash through the night, but a definitive and public break from her monastic commitment, enabled by the changing religious climate and the support network of the reformers. After leaving the convent, Anna Regina did not fade into obscurity. Like many former nuns of her time, she sought to build a new life in accordance with her reformed beliefs. The reformers, particularly Luther, actively encouraged and facilitated marriages for former religious, seeing it as the divinely ordained state for all Christians. Anna Regina eventually married Hieronymus von Konneritz, a nobleman and supporter of the Reformation in Saxony. Her marriage was a testament to her embrace of the new theological order and a public affirmation of her renunciation of monastic celibacy. As the wife of a Saxon nobleman, Anna Regina continued her life within the Protestant community, raising a family and participating in the secular world from which she had once been excluded. Her story, though less dramatic than some, is representative of the profound personal impact of the Reformation on countless lives. She was a woman who, driven by faith and the promise of a different kind of spiritual freedom, chose to leave the sheltered but confining world of the cloister for the complexities and challenges of a life lived openly within the Reformed faith. Her journey from nun to noblewoman and wife symbolizes the dramatic shifts in female roles and religious understanding that defined the 16th century. Number 2. Margaret Anna Cusack, Sister Mary Frances Clare, the nun of Kenmare who broke free. In the Ireland of the mid-19th century, a land grappling with famine, poverty, and profound religious tensions, the life of a nun was often one of unwavering devotion, immense charity, and quiet sacrifice. Yet, even within the confines of such a life, individual spirits could ignite with a passion for reform and social justice that sometimes clashed with the very institutions they served. This was the complex journey of Margaret Anna Cusack, known famously as the Nun of Kenmare, a woman whose tireless work for the poor and her eventual dramatic departure from her religious order made her a figure of both admiration and fierce controversy. Born in 1829 in Dublin, Ireland, Margaret Anna Cusack came from a Protestant family. However, at the age of 24, she converted to Roman Catholicism, a significant step in a religiously divided Ireland. Her deep faith and desire for service led her to enter the Poor Clares convent at Newry in 1858, taking the religious name Sister Mary Frances Clare. She quickly became known for her intellectual prowess, her fervent piety, and her extraordinary energy. She was not content with merely following the routine. She possessed an ardent desire to serve the marginalized and to advocate for social change. Sister Mary Frances Clare's work quickly extended beyond the traditional cloister. She was a prolific writer, penning numerous books on Irish history, hagiography, and social commentary. Her writings were popular and provided much-needed income for her order. More importantly, she became deeply involved in charitable work, particularly in County Kerry, a region devastated by the lingering effects of the Great Famine. In 1861, she was sent to Kenmare, where she founded a new convent of the Poor Clares. Here she dedicated herself with formidable energy to alleviating poverty and suffering. She established schools, orphanages, and industrial training programs, providing education and skills for the impoverished children and adults of the region. She became known as the Nun of Kenmare, due to her tireless work and passionate advocacy for the Irish poor. Her activism was not without its challenges. She openly criticized injustices, including aspects of the landlord system and the systemic poverty that afflicted so many. Her outspoken nature and her direct approach, while effective, sometimes put her at odds with local clergy and even elements within her own order, who preferred a more traditional and less confrontational approach to charity. Despite this, her immense popularity among the common people and her success in fundraising for her charities provided her with a degree of protection and influence. However, the seeds of disillusionment were slowly taking root. Sister Mary Frances Clare, a woman of strong convictions and an independent mind, began to experience increasing friction with her superiors and the local hierarchy. There were disagreements over financial matters, particularly regarding the vast sums she raised through her writings and fundraising efforts, and how these funds should be managed and spent. She felt that her efforts to help the poor were being hampered by bureaucratic constraints and a lack of true support from within the church structure. Her direct, uncompromising style, coupled with a growing sense that her work was not fully appreciated or understood, led to a deep sense of frustration. The culmination of these tensions came in the 1880s. Feeling increasingly isolated and unable to achieve her vision for social justice within the confines of her order and the Catholic Church, Sister Mary Frances Clare made the momentous decision to leave. In 1884, she left the Poor Clares, and in a move that shocked many, she publicly converted to Protestantism, rejoining the Church of Ireland. This was not a quiet departure. It was a sensational runaway from the Catholic Church itself, and from the religious life she had embraced for decades. For a prominent nun, known for her devotion and her work, to abandon her vows and her faith was an act of profound defiance and a lightning rod for controversy. Her conversion was met with a storm of criticism from the Catholic Church, which accused her of apostasy and denounced her actions. Protestant circles, while initially welcoming, also found her independent spirit challenging. She continued her social activism and writing, now from a Protestant perspective, even attempting to found a new sisterhood in England. However, her later years were marked by continued conflict, and at times, public legal battles. Margaret Anna Cusack died in 1899. Her story is a powerful testament to a woman who was driven by an unyielding desire for justice and truth, even when it meant breaking with the most profound commitments of her life. Her runaway was not from physical confinement, but from institutional structures that she felt no longer served her conscience or her mission. She abandoned her habit, her vows, and her long-held faith in a dramatic act of personal and spiritual liberation, remaining a compelling, complex, and controversial figure in Irish history. Her life stands as a powerful example of a woman who chose to follow her convictions, no matter the cost. Number 1. Maria Antonia Scalera Brown, the scandalous Italian defector. The late 18th century in Italy was a time when the power of the Catholic Church remained immense, deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of life. For young women, particularly those from noble or affluent families, entering a convent was a common path, often seen as a respectable alternative to marriage, or sometimes as a convenient solution for families with too many daughters or insufficient dowries. Maria Antonia Scalera Brown, born in 1763, was one such woman whose entry into religious life was largely a matter of familial arrangement, but whose subsequent actions would dramatically defy societal and ecclesiastical expectation. Maria Antonia was placed in the convent of Santa Lucia in Celci, Rome, at a young age, likely in her early teens. This cloistered institution provided a structured environment, an education, and a life of apparent piety. As a professed nun, she adopted the routines of the convent, dedicating herself to prayer, communal life, and the quiet contemplation expected of her station. Convent walls were meant to ensure her spiritual and physical confinement, separating her irrevocably from the secular world and its temptations. However, beneath the surface of her monastic life, a restless spirit simmered. Maria Antonia was known for her beauty, charm, and vivacious personality, traits that were perhaps ill-suited to the solemnity of the cloister. The rigid discipline and enforced celibacy of convent life began to chafe against her desires. Like many women placed in convents against their true calling, she found herself yearning for a life beyond the quiet confines of her vows. The spark that ignited her dramatic runaway was a clandestine affair. While still a nun, Maria Antonia began a secret relationship with a man, Count Francesco Savarelli, a member of the Roman aristocracy. Such a relationship was not only forbidden by her vows, but was a profound scandal, punishable by severe ecclesiastical penalties, including excommunication and imprisonment within the convent. The secrecy and danger of the affair only intensified its allure, leading Maria Antonia to consider the unthinkable, abandoning her sacred vows and escaping her consecrated life. The decision to break vows and leave the convent was a monumental one, fraught with immense personal and social risks. It meant defying the authority of the Church, alienating her family, and stepping into a world that would likely ostracize her as an apostate. Yet, her desire for freedom and her love for Savarelli proved stronger than the fear of consequences. In 1787, Maria Antonia Scalera Brown executed her dramatic escape from the convent of Santa Lucia. While the precise details of her flight are not fully documented in sensationalized accounts, such escapes often involved elaborate plans, outside help, and careful timing to avoid detection by the vigilant convent authorities. She successfully eluded capture, making her way into the secular world, a world she had been formally separated from since her youth. Her runaway was a true dash for freedom, a bold and defiant act that sent shockwaves through Roman society. Her departure from the convent and her subsequent public relationship with Count Savarelli ignited a scandal of immense proportions in Rome. Public spectacle of a former nun, particularly one from a respected family, openly living with a nobleman, was a profound challenge to the moral and social order. The Church was swift to react, declaring her an apostate and imposing excommunication. Her family, deeply embarrassed, likely disowned her or severely distanced themselves from her actions. Despite the widespread condemnation and the severe social ostracism, Maria Antonia and Count Savarelli continued their relationship. They eventually married, a further act of defiance against the Church, which did not recognize such a union for a woman who had taken perpetual vows. Maria Antonia lived as Countess Savarelli, embracing a life of society and personal liberty that was a stark contrast to her cloistered past. Her story became a notorious example of a nun who broke free from the constraints of religious life for love. The details of her later life are not as widely known as the initial scandal, but she lived until 1829, a long life that defied the expectations and judgments of her time. Maria Antonia Scalera Brown's Runaway was more than just a physical escape from a building. It was a profound personal rebellion against enforced celibacy, societal norms, and the deeply ingrained power of the Church. Her story remains a captivating example of individual will triumphing over institutional control, forever marking her as one of history's most famous runaway nuns.